She was just about to say "I do," unaware that everything was about to change. Between hidden truths, broken promises, and a love that never truly faded, one unexpected choice will challenge what it really means to love. A story of courage, heartbreak, and a love that waited for the right moment. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Margaret's Church in Westminster, casting prisms of colour across the ancient stone floor. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the entrance of the nave, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the bouquet of ivory roses and peonies. At 32 years old, she had waited what felt like a lifetime for this moment. Her cream-coloured gown, a delicate creation of silk and vintage lace that had belonged to her grandmother, whispered against the floor as she prepared to take her first step down the aisle. 200 guests filled the pews, turning to admire the bride. Eleanor's heart raced with what she believed was pure joy. This is it, she thought. This is the beginning of forever. Her eyes found Richard at the altar, handsome in his mourning suit, smiling that charming smile that had won her over 3 years ago. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as she had dreamed. She began her walk, each step measured and graceful, her father's arm steady beneath her hand. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. Happiness, she told herself. These were tears of happiness. What she did not notice was the man seated in the third row on the left side of the church. James Blackwood sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. His dark eyes followed Eleanor's every movement, drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. She looks like an angel, he thought, and the words cut through him like shattered glass. And I am about to destroy her world. For 3 agonizing weeks, James had carried a secret that burned like acid in his chest. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, of legal consultations, of gathering evidence that would either save Eleanor or shatter her completely. He had hoped, God, how he had hoped, that he was wrong. That the photographs were fabricated, that the bank statements were forged, that Richard Montgomery was not the monster James now knew him to be. But the evidence was irrefutable, and James could not, would not, let the woman he had loved in silence for 5 years marry a man who had been unfaithful since before their engagement, who had fathered a child with another woman, who planned to steal Eleanor's inheritance and disappear. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. The ceremony proceeded with excruciating slowness. Readings were given, hymns were sung, and through it all James felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched Eleanor's face, so radiant, so full of hope, and something inside him died a little. She will hate me for this, he thought, but at least she will be free. The vicar's voice rose above the hushed congregation. If any person here knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage, speak now, or forever hold your peace. The traditional words hung in the air like a held breath. 3 seconds of perfect silence. Then James Blackwood rose to his feet. The movement caught Eleanor's attention. She turned, her smile faltering as she recognized the tall figure with broad shoulders and the dark, intense gaze she had known for 12 years. Her best friend, her confidant, the one person she trusted above all others. I object to this marriage, James said, his deep voice carrying through the church with terrible clarity. Gasps erupted throughout the congregation. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Richard stiffened beside her, his charming mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. James, Eleanor whispered, confusion and disbelief warring in her voice. What are you doing? He stepped into the aisle, his eyes never leaving hers. In his hand, he held a manila envelope, thick with documents, photographs, evidence of a betrayal she could not yet comprehend. Richard Montgomery has maintained a relationship with another woman for the past 2 years, James announced, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. Her name is Victoria Crane. They have a son together, born 8 months ago. He has been transferring money from your joint accounts into offshore holdings, and he intends to use the funds from this wedding to disappear with her to Portugal. The envelope landed at Richard's feet with a soft thud that seemed to echo like thunder. Eleanor stood frozen, her bouquet slipping from nerveless fingers. She turned to Richard, searching his face for denial, for outrage, for anything that would prove this was a terrible mistake. But Richard's expression had transformed. The charm was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating as he realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "Eleanor, darling," he began, reaching for her hand. "This is absurd. James has always been jealous of us. Surely you can see—" "Don't." The word came from James, sharp as a blade. "Don't you dare touch her." Eleanor looked between the two men, her fiancé and her best friend, and felt the ground beneath her feet begin to dissolve. The church spun around her. The whispers of 200 guests became a deafening roar. And then one terrible thought crystallized in her mind, cutting through the shock like a knife through silk. James knew. He knew, and he did not tell me. She met his eyes across the chaos, and in that moment something far more devastating than Richard's betrayal struck her heart. Her best friend, the man she had trusted with her deepest secrets, her greatest fears, her most vulnerable moments, had allowed her to walk down that aisle knowing everything. The tears that fell now were not tears of joy. They were tears of utter devastation. Eleanor ran. She gathered her grandmother's dress in both fists and fled down the aisle she had walked with such hope mere minutes before. The faces of her guests blurred past her, shocked expressions, open mouths, hands reaching out that she could not bear to touch. The heavy oak doors of St. Margaret's burst open beneath her palms, and she stumbled into the grey London morning, gasping for air that would not come. Behind her, she heard James calling her name. His footsteps echoed on the stone steps, quick and urgent, but she could not stop, would not stop. The rain had begun to fall, a soft, persistent drizzle that seemed perfectly suited to the destruction of everything she had believed to be true. Eleanor's silk gown absorbed the moisture, growing heavy, dragging at her ankles as she ran toward the wrought-iron gates of the churchyard. "Eleanor, please!" James caught her arm just as she reached the street, his grip firm but gentle. "Let me explain, please, just let me explain." She whirled on him, and what he saw in her eyes made him release her immediately. This was not the Eleanor he knew, the warm, compassionate woman who saw the best in everyone. This Eleanor was wounded beyond measure, and the fury in her gaze was directed entirely at him. 3 weeks, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew for 3 weeks." James ran a hand through his rain-dampened hair, his chest heaving. In his perfectly tailored morning coat, with raindrops clinging to his dark lashes, he looked every inch the successful corporate titan he was. But beneath that polished exterior, he was falling apart. "I needed proof," he said desperately. "Eleanor, you have to understand, Sash, if I had come to you with rumors, with suspicions, would you have believed me? Richard had you convinced that I was jealous, that I never approved of him. I had to be certain. I had to have evidence you couldn't dismiss. So you let me plan my wedding." Her voice cracked on the word. "You sat across from me at dinner parties and listened to me talk about flower arrangements and honeymoon destinations and our future children, and you knew that it was all a lie." Each word struck James like a physical blow. He had prepared himself for her anger, had known it would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the devastation in her eyes. "I was trying to protect you," he said quietly. "Protect me?" Eleanor laughed, a harsh, broken sound that held no humor. "You humiliated me in front of everyone I know. 200 people, James, my colleagues, my family, my friends. They all watched my life implode in the middle of a church. That is not protection, that is cruelty. Would you rather I had let you marry him?" The question came out sharper than he intended, born of his own anguish. "Would you rather discover his betrayal in 6 months, a year, after he had emptied your accounts and left you with nothing? I would rather my best friend had trusted me with the truth the moment he learned it." They stood facing each other in the rain, two people who had been inseparable for 12 years, now divided by a chasm of pain and broken trust. Eleanor's mascara ran in dark rivulets down her cheeks, her carefully styled hair collapsing around her shoulders. She had never looked more beautiful to James, and she had never been further from his reach. "Tell her," a voice inside him urged. "Tell her why you waited. Tell her that you spent 3 weeks in agony because seeing her hurt would destroy you. Tell her that you love her." But he could not. Not now. Perhaps not ever. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words wholly inadequate for the magnitude of what he felt. "Eleanor, I am so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. You thought wrong. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in her soaked gown. I cannot look at you right now. I cannot be near you. Please, James, if you ever cared about me at all, leave me alone. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. James took a step backward, his hands falling uselessly to his sides. In all the years he had known her, through every crisis and celebration, she had never once asked him to leave. If that's what you need, he said quietly, I'll go. But Eleanor, I need you to know that everything I did, every decision I made, was because I could not bear to see you hurt. She turned away from him, unable to meet his eyes. And yet, here I am, hurt beyond anything I have ever felt. By Richard, yes, but by you as well. At least Richard was a stranger I believed I knew. You were supposed to be different. You were supposed to be my safe place. James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he possibly say? She was right. He had failed her in the most fundamental way, and no explanation could undo the damage. A black taxi appeared at the corner, and Eleanor raised her hand to hail it. The driver's eyes widened at the sight of a bedraggled bride climbing into his vehicle, but he said nothing as she gave an address. James stood on the pavement, rain streaming down his face, watching the taxi disappear into the grey London morning. The woman he loved was gone, and he had no one to blame but himself. I did the right thing, he told himself. She will understand eventually. She has to. But as he turned back toward the church, where chaos still reigned and questions awaited, James Blackwood felt something crack open in his chest. The worst part was not that Eleanor hated him. The worst part was that he was not entirely certain she was wrong to. The days following the ruined wedding blurred together in a haze of grief and humiliation. Eleanor retreated to her flat in Kensington, drew the curtains against the persistent autumn sun, and refused to answer her phone. The device buzzed constantly, messages from concerned friends, curious acquaintances hungry for gossip, and her mother's increasingly frantic voicemails. She answered none of them. On the third day, she stopped eating. The thought of food made her stomach revolt, and besides, what was the point? Everything she had built, every dream she had carefully constructed, lay in ruins at her feet. Richard's betrayal cut deep, but it was James's silence that festered like an open wound. What Eleanor did not know was that James Blackwood had not slept more than 3 hours since the wedding. He paced his penthouse office overlooking the Thames, cancelling meetings, ignoring his board of directors, his mind consumed entirely by her. He knew she needed space. He understood that his presence would only deepen her pain. But standing idle while she suffered went against every instinct he possessed. So he became her invisible guardian. On the fourth day, when her refrigerator stood empty and she had not left her flat, a delivery arrived from Fortnum and Mason, a carefully curated selection of her favorite foods. Soups that required no preparation, fruits already sliced, pastries from the bakery she loved near Covent Garden. There was no card, no indication of the sender. Eleanor assumed it was her mother's doing and felt a flicker of gratitude. When the utility bills arrived, the ones she had forgotten entirely in her fog of despair, James paid them quietly through his assistant, leaving no trace. Her subscription to the literary magazine she adored, which had lapsed during the wedding preparations, mysteriously renewed itself. At night, James would drive past her building, just to see if her lights were on. Just to know she was still there, still breathing, still existing in a world that had become unbearably grey without her in it. This is pathetic, he told himself as he sat in his Aston Martin at 2 in the morning, staring up at her darkened windows. She told you to stay away. You should respect that. But love, he was discovering, did not respond well to logic. His business partner, Marcus Chen, confronted him during what should have been a routine strategy meeting. "You look terrible," Marcus said bluntly, sliding a cup of black coffee across the conference table. "When did you last eat, or sleep, or do anything other than torture yourself over Eleanor Ashworth?" James's jaw tightened at the sound of her name. "This isn't about Eleanor." "Of course it is. It's been about Eleanor for 5 years, mate. Everyone knows it except apparently her." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying his friend with shrewd eyes. "What exactly is your plan here? Pine yourself into an early grave?" "I don't have a plan." The admission cost James more than he cared to admit. In business, he always had a plan. 3 plans, usually, with contingencies for every possible outcome. But when it came to Eleanor, all his strategic brilliance abandoned him. She needs time. She needs space. And when she's ready, if she's ever ready, I'll be here. And if she's never ready, if she marries someone else, has children with someone else, lives her entire life with someone else? James's hand clenched around his coffee cup so tightly that his knuckles went white. The thought of Eleanor with another man, laughing with him, touching him, loving him, sent a wave of nausea through his entire body. "Then I'll watch from a distance," he said quietly, "and be grateful that she's happy." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You're either the most romantic man I've ever met or the most foolish. Possibly both." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this silent devotion was nothing more than self-destruction dressed in noble clothing. But James could not change who he was. He could not rewire a heart that had belonged to Eleanor Ashworth since the moment he first saw her laugh at a charity gala 12 years ago. She had been standing near the champagne fountain, wearing a simple black dress that somehow outshone every designer gown in the room. A colleague had told a joke, not even a particularly good one, and Eleanor had thrown her head back and laughed with such unguarded joy that James had felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "Who is that?" he had asked, and his voice must have betrayed something, because his companion had given him a knowing look. "That's Eleanor Ashworth. Brilliant art curator, apparently. And way out of your league, Blackwood." But she had not been out of his league. They had met properly an hour later, discovered a shared passion for obscure 19th-century novels, and by the end of the evening, James had known 2 things with absolute certainty. First, that he had just found his best friend. Second, that he was in devastating, irreversible trouble. Now, 12 years later, nothing had changed. He still loved her with the same fierce, consuming intensity. He still would walk through fire for a single smile, and he still had no idea how to tell her any of this. On the 7th day, James's phone rang at 6 in the morning. An unknown number, but something made him answer. "Is this James Blackwood?" A young woman's voice, slightly breathless. "Speaking." "This is Charlotte Ashworth, Eleanor's sister. We've met a few times at family events." A pause. "I just landed at Heathrow. I'm coming to take care of her, and I think we need to talk about my sisters and about you." Charlotte Ashworth swept into Eleanor's flat like a force of nature. At 28, she possessed the same delicate bone structure as her older sister, but where Eleanor was quiet grace, Charlotte was vibrant energy. She took one look at the drawn curtains, the untouched food deliveries, and her sister's hollow eyes, and immediately began to work. Within an hour the curtains were open, the windows cracked to admit fresh autumn air, and the kettle was whistling on the stove. Charlotte moved through the flat with purposeful efficiency, tidying without judgment, creating order from chaos. Eleanor watched from the sofa, wrapped in a blanket that had not left her shoulders in 3 days. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly. "I know you're busy with the gallery opening in Edinburgh." "Don't be ridiculous." Charlotte pressed a steaming cup of chamomile tea into her sister's hands. "When I heard what happened, I was on the next flight. The gallery can wait. You cannot." They sat together in silence for a long moment, the afternoon light painting golden rectangles on the hardwood floor. Eleanor sipped her tea and felt, for the first time in a week, something loosening in her chest. "I feel like such a fool," she whispered. "Everyone must have known. About Richard and that woman. Though they all must have been laughing at me." "No one was laughing." Charlotte's voice was firm. "Richard fooled everyone, not just you. He was very good at what he did. Convincing, charming, utterly without conscience. You are not foolish for believing someone you loved." But James knew. The name caught in Eleanor's throat. "My best friend in the entire world, and he kept it from me for 3 weeks. How am I supposed to forgive that?" Charlotte set down her own cup carefully, her expression shifting to something Eleanor could not quite read. "Can I tell you something? Something that might change how you see this situation?" What could possibly change any of this? Rain began to patter against the windows, gentle and persistent. Charlotte reached out and took her sister's hand, her grip warm and steady. "James Blackwood is in love with you," she said simply. "He has been for more than 5 years. Everyone knows. Everyone has always known, and except you." Eleanor stared at her sister, certain she had misheard. "That's absurd. James and I are friends, best friends. He's never once suggested—" Of course he hasn't, because he's James. Charlotte's smile was sad and knowing. The man who would rather suffer in silence than risk making you uncomfortable. The man who has turned down every woman who has shown interest in him because none of them are you. Charlotte, I think you're reading something that isn't... Do you remember Claire Hartington, the investment banker he dated briefly 2 years ago? Eleanor frowned. Vaguely. I thought they were quite compatible. She ended things after 4 months because, in her words, there was no point competing with a ghost. She told me at a dinner party that James said your name in his sleep, that whenever you called or texted, his entire demeanor changed. That she knew from the first week that his heart belonged to someone else. The tea in Eleanor's hands had gone cold. She set it aside with trembling fingers, her mind racing through years of memories, desperately searching for something she had apparently been blind to for half a decade. James, at her 30th birthday, watching her blow out the candles with an expression of such tender devotion that her mother had commented on it later. James flying back from Tokyo mid-business trip, because she had mentioned casually that she was nervous about a presentation. James always knowing her coffee order, her favorite flowers, the exact shade of lipstick that made her feel confident, small details that she had dismissed as the attentiveness of a close friend. "Oh God," she breathed. "Oh God, Charlotte, how did I not see it?" "Because you weren't looking. Because you trusted that if James felt something, he would tell you. Because Richard swept in and dazzled you. And by the time James might have gathered the courage to speak, it was too late." Eleanor pressed her palms to her eyes, her thoughts spiraling. The wedding. He interrupted the wedding because he could not bear to watch you marry someone unworthy of you. And yes, he waited 3 weeks with that horrible knowledge because he needed proof you couldn't dismiss. Can you imagine what those weeks must have been like for him? Loving you, knowing what Richard was and having to stay silent until he could protect you properly? A sob escaped Eleanor's throat, the first tears she had allowed herself since fleeing the church. They came now in great heaving waves, washing away some of the numbness that had encased her heart. Charlotte held her through it, stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort. When the storm finally passed, Eleanor sat back, wiping her cheeks with the edge of her blanket. Her mind felt clearer than it had in days, but her heart was a tangled mess of confusion. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted, "about any of this. Richard's betrayal is still so fresh, and now to learn about James, you don't have to figure it out today." Charlotte squeezed her hand. "Or tomorrow, or next week. But I wanted you to understand why he did what he did. Not because he was cruel or cowardly, but because he loves you enough to let you hate him, if that's what it takes to keep you safe." Eleanor looked toward the window, where the rain had softened to a fine mist. Somewhere in this vast city, James Blackwood was going about his day, or trying to. She wondered if he was thinking about her. She wondered if he was hurting as badly as she was. And she wondered, with a flutter of something terrifying and new, what it would mean if she let herself look at him with different eyes. 3 weeks after the wedding that never was, Eleanor finally agreed to see James. She chose a small cafe in Hampstead, far from the prying eyes of their social circle, a place where no one would recognize the woman whose life had imploded so spectacularly in St. Margaret's Church. She arrived 15 minutes early, her hands wrapped around a cup of Earl Grey she had no intention of drinking, her heart beating so loudly she was certain the other patrons could hear it. When James walked through the door, Eleanor barely recognized him. The man who approached her table bore little resemblance to the polished corporate titan she had known for 12 years. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. His usually immaculate appearance, the pressed shirts, the perfectly knotted ties, had given way to a simple grey jumper and trousers that looked as though they had been pulled on without thought. He looked, Eleanor realized with a start, as broken as she felt. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," James said quietly, sliding into the chair across from her. His voice was hoarse, as though he had not used it much in recent days. "I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I." Eleanor studied him. This man she thought she knew better than anyone. Charlotte's revelation echoed in her mind, coloring everything she saw. The way his eyes searched her face with barely concealed desperation. The slight tremor in his hands as he reached for the menu he would never read. "He loves me. He has loved me for 5 years." The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, frightening and strange and somehow inevitable. "I need to apologize," James began, but Eleanor held up her hand. "Let me go first, please." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I said terrible things to you outside the church. I called you a coward. I said you had betrayed me. And while I still believe you should have told me sooner, I understand now that your intentions were—" "No." James's interruption was gentle but firm. "You were right to be angry. I should have found a way to tell you privately, with compassion, instead of letting it explode in public. So I told myself I was protecting you, but some part of me—" He broke off, his jaw tightening. "Some part of me wanted to destroy him in front of everyone who had watched him charm his way into your life. That wasn't protection. That was vengeance, and you paid the price for it." Eleanor stared at him. In all the years she had known James Blackwood, she had never heard him admit to anything less than perfect rationality. His business reputation was built on cold logic, calculated decisions, emotions held firmly in check. This raw honesty was something new, something that made her see him in a different light. "Why didn't you tell me when you first found out?" she asked softly. "The real reason, not the logical one about evidence, the truth." James was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because telling you meant watching your heart break. And I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Protecting you has always been instinct for me, Eleanor, not calculation. Every time you've been hurt, every time you've struggled, something in me responds before I can think. The idea of being the one to cause you pain. I couldn't do it. Not until I had no other choice." A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek before she could stop it. James reached across the table, his thumb brushing gently against her skin, catching the drop before it could fall. The touch was electric. Eleanor felt it spark through her entire body, a current of awareness that made her breath catch. James felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes darkened, the way his hand lingered against her cheek for just a moment longer than necessary. Then he pulled back, clearing his throat, and the moment passed. "I've missed you," Eleanor admitted, surprising herself with the words. "These past weeks, even when I was furious with you, I missed you. You've been part of my life for so long that not having you felt like losing a limb. I never left." James's voice was rough. "I couldn't. Even when you told me to stay away, I was there, making sure you were eating, that your bills were paid, that was you." Eleanor's eyes widened. "The food deliveries, the utilities. I thought it was my mother." A faint flush crept up James's neck, the first color she had seen in his face since he arrived. "I overstepped. I know I did. But the thought of you suffering alone when I could do something—" "James." She reached out, her fingers closing around his wrist. "Thank you. I didn't know, but thank you." They sat like that for a moment, connected by that simple touch, and Eleanor felt something shift between them. The anger that had burned so hot in the aftermath of the wedding had faded, leaving behind something more complex. Gratitude, certainly. Understanding. And beneath it all, a flicker of something she was not yet ready to name. "I'd like to try again," she said finally. "Being friends, I mean, if that's still something you want." James's smile was small and sad and utterly beautiful. "There is nothing in this world I want more." They talked for hours after that, carefully at first, navigating around the wounds that were still too fresh to touch, and then more freely as the afternoon light softened into evening. James made her laugh for the first time in weeks, with a story about a disastrous board meeting, and Eleanor found herself leaning toward him, drawn by something magnetic and new. When they finally parted outside the cafe, the autumn air cool against her cheeks, Eleanor looked at James and saw not just her best friend, but something more, something that terrified her to her very core. "Same time next week?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. "I'll be here," James promised. And the way he looked at her, with such naked hope and devotion, made Eleanor's heart stumble in her chest. She walked home through the lamplight streets, her mind spinning with questions she did not know how to answer. The weeks that followed brought a gradual transformation that neither Eleanor nor James dared to name. What began as tentative weekly meetings at the Hampstead Cafe evolved into something richer. Dinners at quiet restaurants, where they would talk until the staff began stacking chairs. Walks through Hyde Park as the leaves turned from gold to russet to bare branches against grey skies. Conversations that stretched from evening into the small hours of the morning, covering everything from childhood memories to philosophical debates to comfortable silences that needed no filling. Eleanor discovered depths in James she had somehow missed in 12 years of friendship. "You never told me you played piano," she said one evening, standing in his penthouse as he sat at the grand piano by the window. His fingers moved across the keys with unexpected grace, drawing out a melody that made her chest ache with its beauty. James glanced up, a hint of self-consciousness in his expression. "You never asked. Besides, it felt too revealing. Music was always the place where I couldn't hide." "Then why are you showing me now?" He held her gaze for a long moment before returning his attention to the keys. "Because with you I'm tired of hiding." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor lowered herself onto the piano bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and listened as he played. There were lighter moments too, instances of unexpected joy that caught Eleanor off guard. One rainy afternoon, James attempted to cook her dinner and somehow managed to set off every smoke alarm in his building. They ended up sitting on his kitchen floor, eating Chinese takeaway from cartons, laughing so hard that tears streamed down Eleanor's face. "I genuinely don't understand what went wrong," James said, staring mournfully at the charred remains of what had been intended as chicken piccata. "I followed the recipe exactly." "James, the recipe said medium heat. You had the burner on maximum. I was trying to be efficient." Eleanor dissolved into giggles again, and James watched her with an expression of such pure adoration that she felt it warm her from the inside out. These moments, silly, unguarded, perfectly imperfect, were becoming the highlights of her weeks. But beneath the growing closeness, fear lurked like a shadow. How could she trust again? The question haunted Eleanor in quiet moments, when James wasn't there to distract her from her own thoughts. Richard had seemed perfect too once. He had been charming and attentive and full of promises that turned to ash. What if she was simply repeating the same pattern, seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was truly there? "But James isn't Richard," a voice inside her argued. "You've known James for 12 years. You've seen him at his best and worst. He has never been anything but honest with you. Except for those 3 weeks," another voice countered. "He kept a secret that shattered your world." The internal battle exhausted her. One evening, as they walked along the south bank with the Thames glittering darkly beside them, James seemed to sense her turmoil. "You're somewhere else tonight," he observed quietly. "Where did you go?" Eleanor hesitated. She had always been honest with James. It was the foundation of their friendship. But this particular truth felt dangerous to speak aloud. "I'm scared," she finally admitted, "of everything I'm feeling, of how quickly things are changing between us. I look at you now and I see something I didn't see before, and it terrifies me because the last time I let myself feel something for someone, he destroyed you." James stopped walking, turning to face her. The city lights reflected in his dark eyes. "I know, and I would give anything to take that fear away, but I can't. All I can do is show you, day after day, that I am not him, that I never could be." "How can you be so certain?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "How do you know you won't hurt me?" James reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with infinite gentleness. The touch sent shivers down her spine. "Because hurting you would mean hurting myself," he said simply. "You are not separate from me, Eleanor. You haven't been for a very long time. Your pain is my pain, your joy is my joy. I couldn't betray you any more than I could betray my own heart." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But the scars Richard had left ran deep, and healing was not a straight line. "I need time," she whispered. "I know that's not fair to you, but I need—" "Take all the time you need." James's smile was tender, despite the longing in his eyes. "I have waited 5 years already. I can wait longer." 5 years. The number struck Eleanor anew, the weight of his devotion settling around her shoulders like a cloak. 5 years of loving her in silence. 5 years of watching her with another man. 5 years of hoping and hurting and never saying a word. "James," she didn't know what she wanted to say. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "I'm sorry" felt wrong. "I think I might be falling for you" was too terrifying to voice. "You don't have to say anything," he assured her. "Just know that whatever you decide, whenever you decide it, I will be here. Not as an obligation or an expectation, simply because there is nowhere else I would rather be." They resumed their walk in silence, but something had shifted. Eleanor's hand found James's in the darkness, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. He squeezed gently, asking nothing, promising everything. And Eleanor, despite her fear, did not let go. The doorbell rang at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, just as Eleanor was preparing for dinner with James. She had spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing her outfit, a deep burgundy dress that Charlotte had insisted brought out the warmth in her complexion, and was fastening a delicate gold necklace when the sound interrupted her. She assumed it was James, arriving early as he often did, and opened the door with a smile already forming on her lips. The smile died instantly. Richard Montgomery stood in her doorway, looking every bit as polished and handsome as the day she had agreed to marry him. His blue eyes, eyes she had once found captivating, now seemed hollow, calculating, but his expression was arranged in perfect contrition. His shoulders slumped in studied defeat. "Eleanor," he breathed, as though her name was a prayer. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, to call James, to do anything other than stand frozen, staring at the man who had shattered her world. "How did you find my address?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I moved after your mother." Richard had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "I convinced her I needed to apologize properly. She's always had a soft spot for me." Of course she had. Margaret Ashworth had adored Richard from the moment Eleanor brought him home, the perfect son-in-law she had called him. Distinguished family, excellent prospects, impeccable manners, all the things that mattered to Margaret and none of the things that should have. "You need to leave," Eleanor said firmly. "There is nothing you could say. She manipulated me." Richard's voice cracked with convincing emotion. "Victoria, I know how it sounds, but you have to understand. I was weak, Eleanor. I was struggling with the pressure of the wedding, the expectations, and she was there offering comfort, making me feel—" "Making you feel what exactly? Special, desired?" Eleanor's fear was crystallizing into anger, hot and clarifying. "You had a child with her, Richard. That's not a moment of weakness. That's a choice made over and over again for 2 years. "I know. God, I know." He reached for her hand, and Eleanor jerked backward as though burned. "But I've ended it. Completely. I told Victoria I could never see her again, that what we had was a mistake. I want to come home, Eleanor. I want to earn back your trust." "Trust?" The word came out as a bitter laugh. "You don't even understand what that word means. Then teach me. Give me a chance to learn." Richard's eyes glistened with what might have been genuine tears or might have been expert performance. Eleanor could no longer tell the difference. What we had was real. 3 years of love, of planning our future together. You can't tell me that meant nothing. She wanted to dismiss him outright. She wanted to feel nothing but contempt for this man who had lied to her so thoroughly. But standing here, confronted with the ghost of her former life, Eleanor felt something unexpected creep through her defenses. Not love, not even affection, but something darker and more insidious. Fear. Fear of the unknown path stretching before her with James. Fear of trusting again only to be betrayed again. Fear of vulnerability, of opening her heart, of risking everything she had left on something that might not survive. Richard represented safety, in a twisted way. She already knew the worst of him. There were no more surprises lurking in the shadows. With James, everything was new and terrifying and uncertain. "I don't know," she heard herself whisper, and immediately wished she could take the words back. Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, triumph flickering behind the mask of contrition, before he composed himself again. "That's all I ask. Just think about it. Please." He left his new phone number on a card, pressed it into her trembling hand, and walked away with the confident stride of a man who believed he was winning. Eleanor stood in her doorway for a long moment after he'd gone, staring at the card as though it might explode. That was how James found her 10 minutes later. He had brought flowers, autumn roses in shades of amber and cream, but they hung forgotten at his side as he took in her pale face, her rigid posture, the card clutched in her fingers. "What happened?" His voice was sharp with immediate concern. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" Richard was here. The words tasted like ash. "He wants me back. He says he's ended things with Victoria, that he made a mistake. And you're considering it. The accusation, because that's what it was, despite the flatness of his tone, made Eleanor flinch. No, I don't know. James set the flowers down on the hall table with exaggerated care. His face had gone very still, and Eleanor recognized the mask descending, the controlled, emotionless facade he wore in boardrooms and negotiations. You need time, he said quietly. Time to decide what you want. James, please. No, you're right. His smile didn't reach his eyes. This is a significant decision. You shouldn't rush it. I'll give you space to think. He was pulling away from her. She could feel it happening in real time, the warmth draining from his expression, the distance growing between them, even though neither had moved. I didn't say I wanted him back, Eleanor protested. I only said I was confused, and confusion is valid. James's voice was gentle, impossibly kind, and somehow that made it worse. I would never ask you to choose before you're ready. Just let me know when you've made your decision. He kissed her forehead, a chaste, almost fraternal gesture that felt like a goodbye, and then he was gone, walking down the hallway toward the lift, with the careful steps of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. Eleanor watched him go and felt something inside her crack open with anguish. What had she done? The dinner plans were forgotten. She spent the night pacing her flat, replaying every word, every expression, every terrible moment. She didn't want Richard. She knew that with certainty. But the fear that had paralyzed her in that doorway, fear of moving forward, fear of loving again, fear of James, had made her hesitate. And in that hesitation she had wounded the one person who had never stopped fighting for her. She picked up her phone a dozen times to call him, but what could she say? I'm not choosing Richard, I'm just terrified of you? That seemed worse somehow. That seemed like the cruelest truth of all. So she sat in the darkness, wrapped in silence and regret, and wondered if she had just destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her. The headquarters of Blackwood Enterprises occupied the top 5 floors of a gleaming tower in Canary Wharf. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the building was dark except for a single light burning on the executive level, James's corner office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the sleeping city. James sat at his desk, tie loosened, jacket discarded, surrounded by documents he had been staring at for hours without absorbing a single word. The whiskey in his glass had gone untouched. He didn't want to dull the pain. Some part of him believed he deserved to feel every sharp edge of it. She hesitated. The image played on repeat in his mind. Eleanor standing in her doorway, Richard's card in her hand, uncertainty written across her beautiful face. After everything Richard had done, after the lies and the betrayal and the public humiliation, she had hesitated. Of course she did, the cruel voice in his head whispered. She was going to marry him. She loved him. You're just the friend who was convenient when she needed comfort. He knew it wasn't true. He knew Eleanor better than that. But pain had a way of twisting logic into unrecognizable shapes. The soft knock at his door made him look up sharply. His assistant had gone home hours ago. Security should have cleared the building. Who? Charlotte Ashworth stood in the doorway, her coat still damp from the autumn rain, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. Your security guard is very dedicated, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I had to convince him I was having a family emergency, which, in a way, I suppose I am. James rose from his chair, confusion cutting through the fog of his despair. Charlotte, how did you know I was here? Because I know what you do when you're hurting. You work until you can't think anymore. She crossed to the window, gazing out at the glittering cityscape. My sister is doing the same thing, by the way, except she's pacing her flat and crying instead of pretending to read quarterly reports. She should talk to Richard if she— Oh, stop it. Charlotte turned to face him, her eyes flashing. Stop being noble and self-sacrificing and stupidly honorable for 5 minutes and listen to me. Eleanor doesn't want Richard. She never wanted Richard. Not really. She wanted safety and stability and the life her mother always told her she should have. Richard was a costume she wore because she thought it fit. James's jaw tightened. She hesitated, Charlotte. I was standing right there. I saw it. Yes, she hesitated, but not because she has feelings for that worthless excuse for a man. Charlotte moved closer, her voice softening. She hesitated because she's falling in love with you, and that terrifies her more than anything Richard could ever do. The words hit James like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, his hand gripping the armrest as though it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. What? Think about it. Richard hurt her, yes, but she knew him for 3 years. She can predict him, contain him, understand exactly what went wrong. You? Your 12 years of history being rewritten. You're everything she thought she knew turned upside down. You're the possibility that love can be real and true and worth the risk, and that's the scariest thing she's ever faced. James stared at Charlotte, hope and anguish warring in his chest. She told you this? Not in so many words. Eleanor never says things directly when she's scared. But I know my sister, and I know you. Charlotte sat down across from him, her expression gentle. You've loved her for 5 years without asking for anything in return. Don't give up now. Not when you're this close. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything unspoken. Finally, James spoke, his voice rough with emotion. There's something you don't know. Something I've never told anyone. He rose and walked to the window, his back to Charlotte, unable to face her while the words emerged. Before Eleanor, there was someone else, a woman named Catherine. We were together for 2 years. I thought I loved her. I thought we had a future. What happened? She left. The word was simple, but the pain behind it was not. One morning, without warning, she simply left. Packed her things while I was at work and disappeared. I found a note saying she'd realized she wanted something different. Someone different. That what we had wasn't enough. Charlotte remained silent, waiting. I searched for meaning, for explanation, but there was none. Just absence where certainty had been. James pressed his palm against the cold glass. I told myself I would never be vulnerable again. I built walls so high that no one could reach me. For years it worked. And then I met Eleanor. He turned to face Charlotte, and the rawness in his eyes made her breath catch. With Catherine, I was comfortable. I existed in a pleasant routine without ever being truly alive. But Eleanor, his voice broke slightly. Eleanor woke something in me that I didn't know was sleeping. She makes me feel more in a single moment than I felt in 2 years with Catherine, and that's why I'm terrified too, because now I know what I have to lose. And losing her would... You won't lose her. Charlotte stood and crossed to him, placing a hand on his arm. But you have to fight for her, not by giving her space, not by being patient and understanding while she spirals. She needs to know that you're not going anywhere, that you'll stand and face the fear with her instead of stepping back and letting her face it alone. James absorbed her words, something shifting in his expression. The resignation that had clouded his features began to lift, replaced by something fiercer. I've spent 5 years loving her from a distance, he said slowly. Maybe it's time I learned to love her up close. Charlotte smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn all evening. Now that's the James Blackwood I know. He reached for his jacket, a new determination in his movements. But as he headed for the door, Charlotte called after him. One more thing. Eleanor will push back. She'll be scared and defensive and possibly furious. Don't let that stop you. Sometimes the people we love most need us to break through their walls, not wait politely outside them. James paused in the doorway, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. Funny. I was thinking exactly the same thing about my own walls. And with that he was gone, striding toward the lifts with purpose in every step. Charlotte watched him go and allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. 2 stubborn, frightened people who had finally found each other. They just needed a little push in the right direction. She had done her part. Now it was up to them. The charity gala at the Victoria and Albert Museum was the event of the autumn season. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across the marble floors, and London's elite moved through the galleries in a symphony of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Eleanor had nearly declined the invitation. The thought of facing the same social circle that had witnessed her humiliation felt unbearable. But Charlotte had insisted. You cannot hide forever, her sister had said firmly. Besides, this is your world. You're one of the most respected curators in London. Walk in there with your head high and show them that Eleanor Ashworth cannot be broken. So here she was, in a stunning emerald gown that flowed like water around her ankles, her hair swept up in an elegant twist, wearing confidence like armor. She had not expected James to attend. According to mutual friends, he had cancelled all social engagements since their painful encounter at her flat. She was wrong. He stood near the entrance to the Renaissance Gallery, devastating in a black tuxedo that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the sharp lines of his jaw. His dark eyes found hers across the crowded room with the precision of a compass finding north. Eleanor's heart stuttered. She considered retreating, finding Charlotte, making some excuse to leave. But before she could move, James was walking toward her with purpose in every step. Not the hesitant approach of their recent encounters, but something more assured. Something that made her pulse race with anticipation rather than anxiety. "You look extraordinary," he said quietly, stopping close enough that she could catch the familiar scent of his cologne. "Though that's hardly news. You always do." "James." Her voice came out breathless. "I didn't expect—" "I know. I should have called first, but I was afraid you'd find a reason not to come." His gaze held hers with an intensity that made the crowded room fade to nothing. "We need to talk, properly, about everything. Here? Now? Dance with me first." He extended his hand, palm up, a question and an offering all at once. "Please." The orchestra was playing a waltz, something classic and romantic that seemed to wrap around them like an embrace. Eleanor placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his fingers closing around hers, and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. James pulled her close, closer than strictly proper, his hand firm against the small of her back, holding her as though she might vanish if he loosened his grip even slightly. Eleanor's free hand rested against his chest, and she could feel his heart beating rapidly beneath her palm. He's nervous, she realized with surprise. This man who commands boardrooms and negotiates billion-pound deals is nervous dancing with me. The knowledge shifted something inside her. "I've been a coward," James murmured, his lips near her ear as they moved together. "Not just with you. With myself. I've spent 5 years loving you from a safe distance because I was terrified of what would happen if I got close." "James, let me finish. Please." His hand tightened on her waist. "That night at your flat when I saw you holding Richard's card, something inside me shattered. But it wasn't because I thought you might choose him. It was because I realized I was about to lose you without ever telling you the truth." They turned together, perfectly in sync despite the trembling that Eleanor could feel running through both of their bodies. "There was someone before," James continued. "A woman named Catherine. I thought I loved her, and she left without warning. For years afterward, I convinced myself that I was protecting myself by never getting that close again. But I wasn't protecting myself. I was suffocating. I was choosing safety over living." Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability he was finally allowing her to witness. This was not the controlled businessman, or even the devoted friend she had known for 12 years. This was James stripped bare, offering her everything he was and everything he feared. "And then there was you," he said softly. "You with your laugh that lights up every room. You who sees beauty in places others overlook. You who makes me want to be braver than I've ever been." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, their breath mingling in the narrow space between them. "I don't want to love you from a distance anymore, Eleanor. I want to love you up close, even if it terrifies me, even if it destroys me." Tears pricked at Eleanor's eyes. She had spent weeks running from these feelings, building walls against the very thing her heart craved. But here in James's arms, with the music swelling around them and his confession hanging in the air, she felt those walls begin to crumble. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm so scared of how you make me feel. Every time I look at you now, I see something I missed for years, and I don't understand how I could have been so blind. And then I wonder if I'm blind again, if I'm seeing what I want to see instead of what's real. Then let me show you what's real." James drew back just enough to meet her eyes. "Every day, for as long as it takes. Let me prove to you that this, what's between us, is the most real thing I've ever known." The song ended, but neither of them moved. They stood in the center of the dance floor, wrapped in each other, oblivious to the curious glances from other guests. "No more running?" James asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her back. "No more running," Eleanor agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "But James, I need us to take this slowly. I need to learn how to trust again, not just you, but myself. We go at whatever pace you need." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent shivers cascading down her spine. "I've waited 5 years. I can be patient." The orchestra began a new piece, and this time, when they danced, something had shifted between them. The tension remained, electric and undeniable, but it was accompanied now by hope, by possibility, by the fragile beginning of something neither of them had dared to imagine might actually come true. Later, as James walked her to her waiting car, the cool night air a contrast to the warmth of the gala, Eleanor paused at the curb. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on me." James smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his serious features into something breathtaking. "Giving up on you was never an option, Eleanor. Not then, not now, not ever." She slipped into the car, and as it pulled away, she looked back to see him standing on the pavement, watching until she disappeared from view. Her heart felt full in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. The nightmare came without warning. Eleanor was back in St. Margaret's Church, walking down the aisle in her grandmother's dress, but the faces of the guests had transformed into grotesque masks of mockery. Richard waited at the altar, but when she reached him, his features melted and reformed into something monstrous. She tried to scream, tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the stone floor. And then James was there, reaching for her, but every time she stretched toward him, he moved further away. "You hesitated," his voice echoed through the cavernous space. "You hesitated, and now I'm gone." She woke, gasping, tangled in sweat-dampened sheets, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat. The clock on her bedside table glowed accusingly. 4:17 in the morning. For a long moment, Eleanor simply sat in the darkness, willing her breathing to slow. It was just a dream. James was not gone. Everything was fine. But the trembling would not stop. Before she could second-guess herself, she reached for her phone and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" Her voice broke. "I had a nightmare. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called. It's so late. You were probably... I'm on my way." The sound of movement came through the phone. Footsteps, the jingle of keys. "Keep talking to me. Tell me what you need. Just your voice." She pressed the phone tighter to her ear, as though she could somehow pull him through the connection. "Tell me something real. Something that isn't the nightmare." There was a brief pause, and then James spoke, his voice soft and steady as he drove through the sleeping city. "The first time I saw you laugh, really laugh with your whole heart, we were at Marcus's birthday party. Someone had accidentally knocked an entire tray of canapes onto the CEO of Heartfelt Industries. The man was furious, covered in shrimp toast and olive tapenade, and everyone else was mortified. But you just laughed. Not at him, exactly, but at the absurdity of it all. And that laugh—" He trailed off, and Eleanor found herself hanging on his silence. "What about it?" she whispered. "It rearranged something in my chest. I remember standing there, holding a glass of champagne I'd forgotten existed, thinking, whoever makes this woman laugh like that for the rest of her life will be the luckiest person in the world." A pause. "I'm outside your building." Eleanor was at the door before she consciously decided to move. She buzzed him in and waited, arms wrapped around herself, still shaking from the remnants of the nightmare. When James appeared in her doorway, she didn't think. She simply stepped into his arms. He caught her without hesitation, pulling her close, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other wrapped securely around her waist. He smelled of sleep and leather seats, and something uniquely him, and Eleanor breathed it in like oxygen. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe. I've got you." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, until Eleanor's trembling finally subsided. Then James guided her gently to the sofa, settling beside her without releasing his hold. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked quietly. It was the wedding. Eleanor's voice was small. "The church, and Richard, and everyone laughing at me. And then you were there, but I couldn't reach you. You kept saying I'd hesitated, that you were gone because I hesitated, and I... Look at me." James cupped her face in his hands, tilting it until she met his eyes. "I am not going anywhere. No matter how many times you hesitate, no matter how long it takes you to trust this, I will still be here, do you understand?" The sincerity in his gaze was overwhelming. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. James pressed a kiss to her forehead, tender and protective, lingering against her skin, and she felt something warm bloom in her chest. Safety. This was what safety felt like. Not the false security of a life carefully planned, but the genuine comfort of being truly seen and loved despite every imperfection. They sat together on the sofa as the sky lightened from black to grey to soft pink. James told her stories from his childhood, misadventures with his younger brother, the summers spent at his grandmother's cottage in the Cotswolds, the dreams he'd had before business consumed his life. Eleanor shared her own memories, her father teaching her to appreciate art in museum galleries, the rivalry with Charlotte that had mellowed into fierce devotion, the moment she'd first realized she wanted to spend her life surrounded by beautiful things. By the time dawn fully broke, Eleanor had curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, his arm a comfortable weight around her. "James?" she murmured sleepily. Stay? Just for a little while longer?" He pressed another kiss to the top of her head. "For as long as you'll have me." She drifted off to sleep, feeling for the first time in months completely at peace. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived that would shatter that peace entirely. It was from the Whitmore Foundation, offering Eleanor the position of chief curator at their new gallery in Edinburgh, a role she had applied for over a year ago and long since assumed she would never receive. The opportunity was extraordinary. Carte blanche to build a collection, a generous budget, the chance to shape something entirely new. It was also 300 miles away. Eleanor read the letter twice, her heart sinking with each word. She thought of James, of the fragile, beautiful thing growing between them, and felt the familiar cold grip of impossible choices closing around her throat. How could she possibly leave now? But how could she stay when this was the chance of a lifetime? The letter trembled in her hands as she faced the question she had been dreading all along, whether the love she was just beginning to trust could survive the distance she might have to put between them. Eleanor waited 3 days before telling James about the Edinburgh offer. They were walking through Regent's Park on a Sunday afternoon, the last golden leaves clinging stubbornly to the branches overhead. James had brought coffee from her favourite shop, remembered without asking that she preferred oat milk and a single sugar, and Eleanor felt her heart constrict with the casual intimacy of being known so completely. How could she leave this? How could she leave him? "You're quiet today," James observed, his shoulder brushing hers as they walked. "More than usual. What's troubling you?" Eleanor drew a deep breath and handed him the letter. She watched his face as he read, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the careful way he folded the paper when he finished. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "This is extraordinary, Eleanor. Chief curator, with complete creative control. Everything you've worked toward." "I know." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "But it's in Edinburgh, 300 miles away, and we've only just—" "You should take it." The words struck her like a blow. Eleanor stopped walking, staring at him in disbelief. "What?" James turned to face her, and she saw the pain he was trying so desperately to hide beneath his composed exterior. "You deserve this. You deserve a fresh start, away from everything that happened here, the scandal, the gossip, all of it. Edinburgh could be exactly what you need." "James, I don't understand. I thought—" "I want you to be happy." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with heartbreaking tenderness. "If this opportunity makes you happy, then nothing else matters." Eleanor searched his face for any sign that he was testing her, that he wanted her to refuse. But all she saw was sincerity, and beneath it, a resignation that made her chest ache. "He's letting me go," she realized. "He's giving me permission to leave because he thinks it's what's best for me." The selflessness of it was devastating. "I haven't decided anything yet," she said carefully. "The deadline isn't for another 2 weeks." "Of course." James's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Take whatever time you need." They continued their walk, but something had shifted. The easy comfort between them had been replaced by an undercurrent of sadness, unspoken grief for something that might be ending before it truly began. That night, alone in his penthouse, James stood at the window and allowed himself to fall apart. He had meant every word he said to Eleanor. She did deserve this opportunity. She did deserve a fresh start. But God, the thought of her leaving, of waking each morning in a world where she was 300 miles away, felt like having his heart carved from his chest with a blunt knife. Let her go, he told himself savagely. If you love her, let her go. But the words rang hollow, and the whiskey he poured sat untouched on his desk as he spent the night staring at the city lights and wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. 4 days later, Eleanor made her decision. She would go to Edinburgh, not because she wanted to leave James, but because she needed to prove to herself, and to him, that she could stand on her own. For too long, she had defined herself through relationships. First her family's expectations, then Richard's plans, now this fragile new connection with James. Perhaps some distance would give her clarity. Perhaps it would show them both whether what they felt was strong enough to survive. She was packing boxes in her flat when Charlotte called with news that stopped her heart. "Don't overreact," her sister began, which was never a promising opening. "But I thought you should know before you heard it somewhere else. James was seen at Claridge's last night with a woman. They were having dinner, and apparently she was touching his arm quite a lot." The box Eleanor was holding slipped from her nerveless fingers. "What woman?" she heard herself ask. "Tall, dark hair, absolutely stunning. They looked intimate. I'm sure there's an explanation, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." Eleanor thanked her sister mechanically and ended the call. Then she sat on the floor of her half-packed flat and felt the familiar, terrible sensation of the ground crumbling beneath her. Of course, the cruel voice in her head whispered, "Of course he's already moving on. You told him you might leave. Why would he wait for someone who can't commit to him?" She thought of all his beautiful words, his promises to be patient, his declaration at the gala. Had it all been performance? Had she been fooling herself again, seeing devotion where there was only convenience? The pain was almost unbearable, worse somehow than Richard's betrayal, because this time she had allowed herself to hope. She had begun to believe that love could be different, that James could be different, and now... Eleanor pulled out her phone and stared at James's name in her contacts. She should call him. She should demand an explanation, but the thought of hearing his voice, of having her worst fears confirmed, was more than she could bear. Instead, she made a decision born of panic and self-preservation. She would leave for Edinburgh immediately. She would accept the position, start her new life, and put James Blackwood firmly in her past where he belonged. Whatever they might have had was clearly not meant to be. The removal company could collect her belongings later. All she needed was a suitcase and a train ticket. By the time James learned what had happened, by the time Charlotte, horrified by the unintended consequences of her phone call, explained that the woman at Claridge's was his cousin Victoria, married mother of 3 and his business partner, Eleanor was already gone. He found only an empty flat and a neighbour who mentioned that the nice young woman from 4B had left for Scotland in quite a hurry. James stood in the hallway outside Eleanor's door, his heart pounding, his mind racing. She had left without a word, without giving him a chance to explain. She had seen or heard about him with Victoria and assumed the worst. She thought I betrayed her, he realized, and the pain of that understanding nearly drove him to his knees. After everything Richard did, she thought I was capable of the same thing. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. Perhaps this was a sign. Perhaps the universe was telling him that he and Eleanor were never meant to be. But then another voice rose up, stronger, fiercer, refusing to surrender. No, not like this, not without a fight. He had spent 5 years loving her in silence. He had let fear and circumstance keep them apart, time after time. He would not let a misunderstanding destroy what they had only just begun to build. James pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Cancel everything on my schedule for the next week," he said, his voice hard with determination. "And find out which train Eleanor Ashworth took to Edinburgh." He was done waiting. He was done being patient. It was time to show Eleanor exactly how much she meant to him, even if he had to chase her to the ends of the earth to do it. Eleanor had not unpacked her suitcase. She sat in the sterile hotel room near Waverley Station, staring at the grey Edinburgh skyline through rain-streaked windows, and wondered why victory felt so much like defeat. The Whitmore Foundation had been delighted by her early arrival. They had shown her the gallery space, beautiful, full of potential, and spoken enthusiastically about their vision for the collection. She had smiled and nodded and said all the right things. Inside, she felt hollow. This is what you wanted, she reminded herself. Independence, a fresh start, a life that doesn't revolve around a man who was probably never yours to begin with. But the words rang false, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's face, the way he had looked at her in the park, tender and resigned, telling her to go even as his heart was breaking. Why didn't I fight harder? Why didn't I ask him about that woman instead of running? Because running was easier. Because facing the possibility of another betrayal was more than her battered heart could bear. Because she had spent so many years being strong for everyone else that she had forgotten how to be brave for herself. The knock at her door came just after 7 in the evening. Eleanor assumed it was room service. She had ordered soup she had no intention of eating, and opened the door without checking the peephole. James stood in the corridor. He was disheveled in a way she had never seen before. His usually immaculate hair was windswept, his coat damp from the rain, and there was a wild, desperate look in his dark eyes that made her breath catch. "How did you find me?" she whispered. "I called every hotel near the station until someone confirmed a reservation under your name." He stepped forward and Eleanor stepped back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. "You left without a word, without letting me explain." "What is there to explain?" Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. "Charlotte told me about the woman at Claridge's, the intimate dinner. I understand, James. You thought I was leaving, so you—" "Victoria is my cousin." The words came out sharp, almost angry. "She's married with 3 children and she's also my business partner in the development firm. We were having dinner to discuss the quarterly projections, and yes, she touched my arm, because that's what Victoria does. She's physically affectionate with everyone." Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process this information. "Your cousin?" "My cousin." James moved closer, and this time she didn't retreat. "Did you really think, after everything, that I would turn to another woman, that anyone could even exist for me when every atom of my being belongs to you?" The rawness in his voice undid her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by relief and shame and something far more powerful. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry. I saw, Charlotte told me, and I just assumed." "You assumed the worst because the worst is all you've known." James's hands closed around her wrists, gently pulling them away from her face. "Richard taught you that love is conditional, that people leave, that trust is foolish. But I am not Richard. I never will be. I know." Eleanor looked up at him through her tears. "I know that, James. I've always known that. But knowing something and believing it are different things, and I've been so scared." "I'm scared too." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears with infinite tenderness. "I'm terrified of losing you. I'm terrified of not being enough. I'm terrified that one day you'll wake up and realize you could do better than a man who waited 5 years to tell you how he felt." "James, let me finish." His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and Eleanor felt his breath warm against her lips. "I am in love with you. I have been in love with you since the night I watched you laugh at Marcus's party, and felt my entire world shift on its axis. Every second of the last 5 years, every breath, every heartbeat, it was all for you. You are not a choice I made, Eleanor. You are the only certainty I have ever known." She was trembling in his arms, tears still falling, but something was blooming in her chest, something warm and bright and impossible to contain. "Don't go," James continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Or go, take the job, build your career, become everything you're meant to be. But know that wherever you are, I will be there. I will move my company. I will commute every weekend. I will do whatever it takes, because a life without you is not a life at all." "James." She breathed his name like a prayer, like a promise. "I don't want to go. I thought I did, but I was running away. From you, from how you make me feel, from the terrifying possibility of being truly happy. And now?" Eleanor pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. They were so close she could see the golden flecks in his dark irises, the slight tremor in his jaw, the hope and fear warring in his expression. "Now," she said softly, "I want to stop running." She kissed him. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was the release of years of denial, months of confusion, weeks of longing that had built to an unbearable crescendo. Eleanor pressed her lips to his with desperate urgency, and James responded instantly, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pulled her body flush against his. He kissed her like a man drowning, like she was oxygen and salvation, and everything he had ever needed. His lips moved against hers with fierce tenderness, demanding and giving in equal measure. Eleanor felt the strength of him, the broad shoulders she had admired for years, the arms that held her as though he would never let go, and she understood, finally, what it meant to come home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers once more. "Stay with me," he murmured. "Not in Edinburgh, not in London. Just with me, wherever that leads." Eleanor smiled through her tears, a real smile bright with joy she had almost forgotten how to feel. "There's nowhere else I want to be." James kissed her again, softer this time, reverent. When he pulled back, his eyes were shining with unshed tears of his own. "I've waited so long for you," he whispered. "Sometimes I wasn't sure this moment would ever come. It's here now." Eleanor traced the line of his jaw, marveling at the fact that she was finally allowed to touch him like this. "We're here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the Edinburgh rain continued to fall, but inside that small hotel room, two people who had found their way through fear and misunderstanding finally allowed themselves to believe in something beautiful. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, the future felt bright with possibility. They returned to London together, and everything was different. Eleanor declined the Edinburgh position with a gracious letter, explaining that her circumstances had changed. The Whitmore Foundation expressed disappointment but understanding, and Eleanor felt nothing but relief. She had spent too long chasing what she thought she should want. Now, finally, she was ready to pursue what her heart truly desired. The weeks that followed were a revelation. James and Eleanor navigated their new reality with a mixture of wonder and tentative joy. There were dinners at his penthouse, where he would cook elaborate meals that sometimes succeeded spectacularly and sometimes required emergency takeaway. There were lazy Sunday mornings at her flat, reading the papers in comfortable silence, legs tangled together on the sofa. There were stolen kisses in gallery doorways and held hands beneath restaurant tables, and a growing intimacy that neither had dared to imagine. But the past was not quite finished with them. It arrived on a crisp December afternoon, in the form of a woman standing outside James's office building. Eleanor noticed her first, tall, elegant, with the kind of poise that spoke of breeding and money. She was watching James with an intensity that made Eleanor's stomach clench. "James," the woman's voice carried across the pavement. "We need to talk." Eleanor felt James stiffen beside her. His hand tightened around hers, and when she looked at his face, she saw something she had never seen before, genuine shock. "Catherine," he said quietly, "what are you doing here?" So this was Catherine, the woman who had left without explanation, the ghost who had haunted James for years before Eleanor even knew he was hurting. Catherine stepped forward, her eyes flickering to Eleanor with barely concealed curiosity before returning to James. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I owe you an explanation. I owe you the truth about why I left." Eleanor waited for the jealousy to consume her, for the familiar spiral of insecurity to begin. But standing there, with James's hand warm in hers, she felt something unexpected, calm. "I think you should hear what she has to say," Eleanor said softly. James looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Are you certain? You've carried this wound for years. Maybe this is your chance to finally heal it." She squeezed his hand. "I'll wait at the cafe across the street. Take whatever time you need." She kissed his cheek, a gesture of trust, of faith, and walked away before she could change her mind. James listened as Catherine spoke. She told him about the panic attacks she had hidden throughout their relationship, the depression that had consumed her in the months before she left. She had convinced herself that she was a burden, that James would be better off without her, that leaving was an act of kindness rather than cruelty. "I was wrong," Catherine admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "I should have talked to you. I should have trusted you enough to be vulnerable. Instead, I ran, and I've regretted it every day since." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I'm better now. I've done the work, therapy, medication, all of it. And I came here because I needed you to know that what we had was real to me, and because I wondered if there might be a chance to try again." James was silent for a long moment. He thought about the years he had spent recovering from Catherine's departure, the walls he had built, the way he had convinced himself that emotional distance was the same as safety. And then he thought about Eleanor, her laugh, her courage, the way she had transformed his careful, controlled world into something vibrant and unpredictable. "I'm grateful you told me the truth," James said finally. "I've carried confusion about your leaving for a long time, and understanding helps. But Catherine," he met her eyes with gentle firmness, "with you I was comfortable. I existed in a pleasant routine, but I wasn't truly alive." He glanced toward the cafe window, where Eleanor sat with a book, pretending not to watch. "With her, I live. Every moment, every breath. I'm more present than I've ever been. I love her in a way I didn't know I was capable of loving anyone." Catherine followed his gaze, and something in her expression shifted. Resignation, perhaps, mixed with understanding. "She's lucky," Catherine said quietly. "I'm the lucky one," James replied. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Catherine. Truly. But it won't be with me." They parted with a handshake and the closure of a chapter that had remained painfully open for far too long. When James entered the cafe, Eleanor looked up from her book with carefully concealed anxiety. "Well?" she asked. James slid into the seat across from her and took both her hands in his. She wanted to explain why she left, and she asked if there was a chance for us to try again. He watched Eleanor's face carefully. "I told her no. I told her that I am completely, irreversibly in love with someone else." The tension drained from Eleanor's shoulders. "You didn't have to say that just for my benefit." "I didn't say it for your benefit." James lifted her hands to his lips, pressing kisses to her knuckles. "I said it because it's the truth. You are not competing with my past, Eleanor. You've already won. You won years ago, before I even understood the competition existed." Eleanor blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the certainty in his voice. "I love you," she whispered. "I don't think I've said it properly yet, but I do. I love you, James." His smile was radiant, pure joy without reservation. "I've waited a lifetime to hear those words from you." He leaned across the table and kissed her softly. "And I plan to spend the rest of my life earning them." Outside, December snow began to fall, blanketing London in white. And inside the little cafe, two hearts that had finally found each other beat in perfect synchrony. 3 months after the wedding that never was, Eleanor stood on the rooftop terrace of James's penthouse, wrapped in his arms, watching the stars emerge over London. "My mother called again today," she murmured. "She thinks we're moving too fast, that I should take more time after the scandal before committing to anyone new." James's arms tightened around her. "And what do you think?" Eleanor turned in his embrace, her hands coming to rest on his chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palms. Steady, strong, utterly devoted. "I think I wasted 12 years not seeing what was right in front of me. I'm done moving slowly." She rose on her toes and pressed a kiss to the corner of his jaw. "You're not a rebound, James. You're where I was always meant to land." He kissed her then, deeply, thoroughly, with the kind of tenderness that still made her knees weak. When they parted, his forehead rested against hers. "Thank you for choosing me," he whispered, "even when it was frightening, even when everyone advised against it. Thank you for waiting." Eleanor smiled against his lips. "For loving me before I knew how to love you back." Later that night, in the soft glow of candlelight, they crossed a threshold neither had dared approach before. James's hands trembled slightly as he touched her face, and Eleanor realized with wonder that this powerful, confident man was nervous. Nervous because this mattered, because she mattered. "We don't have to," he began. "I want to." Eleanor took his hands in hers, guiding them to her waist. "I want you, James. All of you." What followed was not the frantic passion of romance novels, but something deeper and more profound. James touched her with reverence, as though she were precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. Every caress asked permission, every kiss spoke of devotion. When they finally came together, Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sensation of being truly seen, truly known, truly loved. James held her gaze throughout, his eyes never leaving hers, and in that intimate space, they were no longer two separate people. They were one heart, one breath, one soul finding its home at last. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Eleanor traced patterns on his chest while James stroked her hair. "I didn't know it could be like that," she admitted quietly. "I didn't know it could feel so complete." James pressed a kiss to her temple. "Neither did I. I've waited my whole life for you, Eleanor. Everything before was just practice." She laughed softly, snuggling closer, and they drifted into sleep wrapped in the warmth of newfound intimacy. 4 months later, the proposal came on a spring evening in the garden of James's grandmother's cottage in the Cotswolds. Cherry blossoms drifted like pink snow around them as James took Eleanor's hands in his. She knew immediately what was happening, the nervous energy radiating from him, the way he kept touching his pocket, but she let him have his moment. "I had a speech prepared," James said, his voice rough with emotion, "something eloquent about fate and destiny and the inevitability of us. But standing here looking at you, I've forgotten every word." Eleanor smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "So I'll just say this. You are my best friend, my partner, my home. Loving you is the greatest privilege of my life, and I want to spend every remaining day proving worthy of your heart." He sank to one knee, producing a ring that sparkled in the fading sunlight, an antique emerald surrounded by diamonds. "Eleanor Ashworth, will you marry me?" "Yes." The word came out as a sob of pure joy. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." James slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then rose and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around while petals swirled around them like confetti. 1 year later, Eleanor sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the small plastic stick in her hands, 2 pink lines, unmistakable. She heard James's footsteps in the hallway, heard him call out that dinner was ready, heard the ordinary sounds of the life they had built together, and she smiled through her tears. "James," she called, her voice slightly unsteady, "could you come here for a moment?" He appeared in the doorway, concern immediately crossing his features. "What's wrong? Are you unwell?" Eleanor held out the test, watching his face as comprehension dawned. For a long moment James simply stared. Then his eyes lifted to hers, filled with such raw wonder that Eleanor's breath caught. "We're going to have a baby?" His voice cracked on the last word. "We're going to have a baby." James crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees before her, his hands cradling her still flat stomach with infinite gentleness. When he looked up at her, tears were streaming freely down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this life, for this love, for everything you've given me." Eleanor threaded her fingers through his hair, tears matching his. "Thank you for never giving up on us." He rose and kissed her, softly, reverently, a promise sealed with joy. Outside their window, London sparkled in the evening light, and inside, 2 hearts that had finally found each other began the next chapter of their extraordinary story. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.